Welcome to the new podcast, In the Garden with Susan. I'm your host, Susan Ladner. I will aim to bring you top quality information on how to save open pollinated seeds, grow a garden, and preserve what you grow. Every Wednesday, I'll be sharing practical tips and techniques to help you on your journey to food security. Join me as I preserve the abundance of produce that my garden provides. Learn new ways of putting food away for the winter and some old ways that are from another century. You can find this podcast on Shopify and at my website. Come on, let's go wander down to the garden and awaken the dreams, history, and love that is held inside every seed. Hello, and welcome to another edition of In the Garden with Susan. And today we have a show that I don't know how it's going to go. I'm not prepared, just to tell you that. I've been very busy trying to get the garden ready. Today, I was picking rocks. I have a bunch of new ground that's been broken. And so it was really in the weeds. It was really a mess. And so I had to get it cleaned up in order that the tractor could get in. And there was huge rocks in there. And oh my gosh, like thistles and burdock and mullein. Anyway, I got it cleaned up and it came and the ground has been turned. And so I've been doing a lot of thinking about water and how to water it because I know many of you know I live 100% off grid. There's no running water here. And there is a big hole that's been dug down at the bottom of my garden. And it is filled with water right now. The question is, how am I going to get the water out of there? But I guess I'll get to that when I have to think about that. And then I have a swimming pool that water is pumped into. And so I hand water. And I had a large garden last year. Everybody thought it was large. And it didn't seem large at first, but then it's large when you have to keep it alive. And it was really hard for me to water it last year. And, it just seemed like that's what I did all last summer was, do school. All I did was schoolwork and then run and try and keep the garden alive. So this year, I just can't. The garden I didn't think it was a big expansion. It didn't seem like it was a big expansion. But now that it's, turned over and I have to clean up this mess, I'm really rethinking what was I thinking. Like I'm a little bit overwhelmed right now. It is a lot for me to clean up. I do everything by hand. And so I'm just going, I don't know if I'll be able to water this. So I started reading a book, and I know I talked about this before. And so it's called Water Wise Gardening by Steve Solomon. And this is what I'm going to do this year is I'm going to dry garden. There's going to be of course, a portion that I'm going to, keep watered, some of my, my cucumbers. And because I noticed last year for some of the seed, and I thought I was watering them. Some of my cucumbers that were going to seed, I don't know if the seeds developed properly. But I mean, they grew like I had self-pollinated them. They looked normal. Everything was, like I've done this for many years. And I'm not sure if because they didn't get enough water, the seeds just didn't plump out. So because I know that maybe they didn't. So I'm thinking a little bit about some of these things that will need the water. So I am going to, keep those guys going. But for some of the other stuff, um, I'm going to do dry gardening. So we're going to talk about that today. And just because there's a lot of things that, with our gardens, and Steve brings this up in his book, like if you're reliant, and like we all are, I mean, well, when I had the 2-acre garden in Ontario, I was dry gardening, and it was because, well, didn't think I was dry gardening, but I read Steve Solomon's book, Gardening in Hard Times, and he talked about spacing things out further. And when you plant things further apart, they don't really need the water. And I mean, I had running water on the farm in Ontario, and we were like trucking water out there all the time. And I had like, I don't know, 10 hoses going way out. And so I was watering by the hose and, whatever. But um, if the water gets shut off, like there's started to be problems with the well there. And I know there are some places like the government's now trying to shut things down. And so I'm going to put, there's a man named Simon Hergott, and he has been doing a documentary about here in BC. I'm not sure if everybody heard about it, what they were doing, but he has a documentary called Stolen Water, and he's on YouTube. It's ground up pictures. And so I'm going to post some of his documentaries down there. I think everyone should really watch it. Like it's amazing what they're trying to do here in BC. They tried to shut down all the water on the farmers. And so we just know that there's some things happening. I had a woman come, and she came to see the garden that was all ripped up, and she was telling me that one of her friends sent her some letter. There's something coming out where the government's going to be saying that there's vegetables we can't grow. And she said one of them was cauliflower. Like she's going to send it to me. I don't know what they think they're doing. Like they're going to try telling us now we can't grow vegetables. Like what I don't think so. Nobody's telling me I can't grow vegetables because I am. Anyway, but we'll get to that when they do. But I mean they're already starting with they're starting sort of with the water on some of these places. So I highly urge my listeners, watch Stolen Water. Everything will be in the show notes. And now I'm going to get into this book. So I'm reading out of the book that's called Water Wise Gardening. And I highly recommend for anyone to get this book because I started reading it. I just love reading books. There's nothing better than, just reading a good book. And this is one of those books that I think it's indispensable. That and his other book, Steve's other book, it's called Gardening in Hard Times. Amazing. So it starts out here talking, and it says drought, and I guess that's the old way they used to say it, but I'm going to say drought because I have a hard time saying drought. Like not a hard time saying the word, but it just seems weird to me, right? So drought is said to be the arch enemy of the dry farmer, but few agree upon its meaning. For the purpose of this volume, drought may be defined as a condition under which crops fail to mature because of an insufficient supply of water. Providence has generally been charged with causing droughts. But under the above definition, man is usually the cause. Occasionally, relatively dry years occur, but they are seldom dry enough to cause crop failures if proper methods of farming have been practiced. There are four chief causes of drought. 1. Improper or careless preparation of the soil. 2. Failure to sorry failure to store the natural precipitation in the soil. 3. Failure to apply proper cultural methods for keeping the moisture in the soil until needed by the plants. And 4. Sowing too much seed for the available soil moisture. And I think that's what a lot of us do now. Like I know myself, sometimes I feel like I have so much I have to grow, and I just start cramming stuff in. And when I had a 2-acre garden, I didn't do that because I had so much space, and everything always did well. And to tell you one story, like that really shocked me, I had a bean variety that I had put way out. I called it the back 40. It was way out there. And I had planted it, and I even had sandy soil on that farm. and I forgot, like, I was gonna water it, but it was so far, like, a 2-acre garden. I'm not sure if you guys can understand, like, I mean, you get so tired at the end of the day sometimes, like, thinking you're gonna walk back to the, like, end of the 2-acre garden to do something. It's just like, no. And so I never ended up going back. I planted all the bean seeds, and I had done what, like, Steve had, suggested, you plant them deeper under there, and I never got back to water them, and we had had no rain, and so one day I went back, and because I remembered, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, I planted those beans and I should be watering them." And I went back there and they were growing. And at that time, it was such a shock for me because one, it had been so dry. I never watered them once. There had been no rain and they were growing. Like, how on earth did that happen? Like, like, to me, it was something that was impossible, but it happened. So I mean, there's that, because I think a lot of us think, and I still do it, I put my seeds in and I water them and water them until they, start growing, because I just feel like they do need that water, and they do when they're all crammed together. But there's just that little story that I had to say. So back to the book. John Wid's, I can't really say his name, Stowe. Anyway, John, whose wise words began this chapter, defines drought as beginning when the crop is severely damaged. The onset of drought has less to do with how much time elapses between rains than with how much water the soil naturally makes available to plants, and upon how wisely the gardener manages the moisture reserve. Being in the vegetable garden seed business, I heard that, and this is Steve talking, I heard about local gardening lore. There was an old guy growing unirrigated crops on deep alluvian sandy loam in the hottest microclimate of the southwestern Oregon. This part of western Oregon also gets the least annual rainfall and has almost no hope of summer rain ever. He sowed carrot seed in spring when the soil was naturally moist enough to germinate it. He soon thinned the row to 1 foot apart. The single rows were 4 feet apart. He gave his carrots no irrigation whatsoever, but they grew to enormous sizes, remained quite edible all summer, and the weight of good quality food harvested from the area involved was not as low as you might think. I found further hints in a book by Gary Nabhan called The Desert Smells Like Rain, which describes Native Americans in Arizona growing unirrigated gardens on deep soil that retains moisture from a brief period of seasonal rains. They used extraordinarily wide interplant spacing. I read about how native South Americans in the Andean highlands grow food crops in a cool, low humidity environment that gets only 12 inches of annual rain, and I discovered John Widstow. So now, gardening with less irrigation. I guess I'm just going to read a bit here. In the spring of 1980, oh no, I'm not going to read that part because I want to get to, maybe I should read some of it because there's some good things here. So he's talking about how he moved around. This is Steve, and then he had this seed company and he sold it, and he moved again, and so um in early May 1988, I moved 6 wintering Savoy cabbage. So here he decides he's going to start saving his own seeds. And so he's living on this farm, and he moved 6 cabbage plants that were going to be grown for seed out far beyond the irrigated soil of my raised bed vegetable garden. I transplanted them 4 feet apart because blooming brassicas make huge splays of flower stalks. I did not plan to water these plants at all because cabbage seed forms during May and it dries down during June as the soil naturally dries out. That is just what happened, except that one plant did something unusual. Instead of drying after setting a massive load of seed, this plant also threw a vegetative bud that grew a new cabbage amongst the seed stalks. With increasing excitement, I watched this head grow steadily larger through the hottest and driest summer I had ever experienced. Realizing I was being gifted with a revelation, I gave the plant absolutely no water, although I did hoe out the weeds around it after I removed the seed stalks. I harvested the unexpected lesson in September. The cabbage weighed 6 pounds and was sweet and tender. I had witnessed a demonstration of how elbow room might be the key to gardening with little or no irrigation. So I researched dry farming and soil water physics. In the spring of 1989, I rototilled a test patch holding 4 widely separated, unirrigated experimental rows with 5 feet between row centers and a few feet of bare soil to either side of the patch. I tested an assortment of vegetable species spaced far apart in the row. To make the game more challenging, I used absolutely no water, not even a sprinkle for the seeds to get them germinating, which meant I had to sow everything in the spring before the topsoil dried out. I tried kale, Savoy cabbage, purple sprouting broccoli, carrots, beets, parsnips, parsley, endive, dry beans, potatoes, French sorrel, and a few sweet corn plants. I included one compact, very early ripening bush determinate and one sprawling indeterminate tomato plant. I confess that these 2 tomato seedlings were given 1 cup of water when they were transplanted. Many of these vegetables grew surprisingly well. I harvested unwatered tomatoes from mid-July through September. Kale, parsley, and root crops fed us through autumn and winter. The purple sprouting broccoli bloomed abundantly until next March. In terms of quality, the harvest from all these vegetables but one was acceptable. The root vegetables were far larger, but only a little bit tougher and were quite a bit sweeter than usual. The potatoes yielded less than I'd been used to and had thicker than usual skin, but also had better flavor and kept especially well through the winter. The rutabagas were a failure. They grew to the size of soccer balls but had been hollowed out by cabbage root maggots. The following year, I grew 2 gardens. Each one occupied 1/6 of an acre. One of them was my insurance garden that was irrigated. Okay, so blah, blah, blah. I don't know if we're going to get into that. I want to get to some of the stuff that I find is really important because I just don't want to be narrating here. So gardening, I'm in chapter 1 now. It's called Gardening with Rain. Before the mid-1970s, American garden books said to arrange most vegetables in long single rows with footpaths between each row. Between row spacing for most vegetables usually ranged from 3 to 4 feet. The distance between rows had as much to do with the amount of anticipated summer rainfall as it did with the type of vegetable. Sprawling crops like winter squash, cucumber, and most tomato varieties were allowed even more space between rows. Small-sized vegetables like carrots and beet might be assigned a pair of parallel rows with a foot between them, the center of each pair of rows 3 or 4 feet to to the next row with a footpath between them. In the eastern half of the United States and Canada, all but a few kinds of vegetables can be successfully foraged for moisture when they grow that way. Okay, so I'm sorry, you guys, that I have things highlighted as I went through the book. I highlighted stuff that I wanted to talk about. And so, okay, so here we go. How soil loses water. Imagine that we kept a test plot entirely bare all summer by rigorously hoeing it as often as any weeds appeared, and hoed once every 3 weeks, no matter what. Because plants growing around the edge of this plot might extend roots into it and extract moisture, we'll make our imaginary tilled area 50 feet by 50 feet and make all moisture measurements in the center. And let's locate this imaginary plot in full sun on flat, uniform soil. Let's also suppose there has been plenty of rain or snow during winter, so that on April 1st, the soil is holding all the moisture it can hold as far down as there is any soil. From early April until well into September, the hot sun will beat down on this bare plot. Let's also suppose this plot is located in western Oregon, where summer rains are very rare and generally come with insignificant installments that do not penetrate deeply. Any rain that does fall quickly evaporates from the surface inch without recharging deeper layers. Most people would reason that a soil moisture measurement taken 6 inches down on September 15th would show very little water left. In fact, most gardeners would expect that there would be very little water found in the soil until we got down quite a few feet, if there were several feet of soil. But that is not what happens. The hot sun dries out the surface of this imaginary test plot, but if on September 15th we dig down 6 inches or so, we would encounter damp soil. Bare, loose earth does not evaporate much water. Isn't that amazing? Once a surface layer has been completely desiccated, very little loss of moisture occurs further down. The only soils that dry out rapidly when bare are certain kinds of very heavy clays that form deep cracks as they dry out. These ever-deepening openings allow the air to evaporate additional moisture. But if the cracks are filled with dust by surface cultivation, even this soil type ceases to lose water. Soil serves as our moisture bank, holding available water in storage. Hot sun and wind working directly on soil don't evaporate much water. Most moisture loss is caused by hot sun and wind working on plant leaves, making them transpire moisture, drawn from the earth through their root systems. Plants will desiccate soil to the ultimate depth and lateral extent of their rooting ability, and then some. Okay, so rain, snowmelt, and irrigation are not the only ways soil moisture is replenished. If the soil is deeper than the plant root systems can penetrate, water will gradually rise from below to the root zone by a process called capillary flow. Okay, so there's that. I know we're running out of time. I can't believe we're running out of time, and I have so much to say. Well, of course, how can I read a book in half an hour? Okay, so there was that. Lower plant density, the key to water-wise gardening. Okay, so I'm just skipping around here, you guys. Unseen competition for root room slows down much more than light competition does. So, I mean, you've got your plants out there, and if you've got them too crowded, like they're not growing properly. Because if there's other roots in their root zone, they're just not growing well. Even if moisture is regularly recharged by irrigation, and even if depleted nutrients are replaced, once a bit of earth has been occupied by the roots of one plant, it is not readily available to the roots of another. So, allocating more elbow room allows vegetables to grow larger, yield longer, and allows the gardener to reduce the frequency of irrigation. So, there's that. If there are no plants and the bare surface inch is kept loose so it dries out nearly completely, most soil water will stay unused throughout the entire growing season. That is amazing. Like I never knew that that could happen. I always thought once I saw it drying out, it was all dry. Okay, plants must use some of their precious energy in order to extract water from the soil. The correct name for this effort is moisture stress. Any degree of moisture stress slows growth to the same degree because it uses up plant energy that it could have used to form new roots or leaves. When the soil is quite damp, moisture stress is inconsequential. Growth slows noticeably after available soil moisture has lessened about halfway from its capacity to the wilting point. Even greater moisture stress may not be enough to cause temporary wilting, but it hugely slows growth. On very closely planted beds in hot, sunny weather, a crop can experience strong moisture stress within a day or two of being irrigated. But if that crop were planted far less densely, it might grow well for a few weeks without irrigation. And if that crop were planted even further apart so that no crop canopy ever developed and a considerable amount of bare, dry earth were showing, this apparent waste of growing space would result in an even slower rate of soil moisture depletion. On a deep, open soil, the crop might grow on through many rainless weeks and still yield a respectable amount without needing any irrigation at all. This paragraph has summed up the essence of dry gardening. You might be not so fortunate as to be gardening in a deep, open, moisture-retentive soil, but all gardeners, except those with the shallowest soil, can increase their use of the free moisture nature provides and also lengthen the time between irrigations. Most gardens can yield abundantly if only we reduce the competition for available soil moisture, judiciously fertigate some vegetable species, and practice a few water-wise techniques. Does lowering plant density equal lowering the yield? Surprisingly, the amount harvested does not drop proportionately. In most cases, having a plant density 1/8 of that recommended by intensive gardening advocates will result in a yield about half sorry will result in a yield about half as great as on closely planted raised beds. Reducing plant density by half does not reduce yield by half. What what a lower plant population does achieve is to encourage all the plants to grow larger and faster. The size of the carrot or head of broccoli will increase. However, it may take a few days longer for that large head or root to develop. So, this is really amazing, you guys. I'm almost out of time here, and I wish I could go on, but I really recommend, for those of you who have found this interesting, because there's just so much information in this book. And I'm not even done reading it. Like, I think I didn't even get a quarter of it into it, and just what I've read so far is like, wow. So I'm going to put this book in the show notes below, and I encourage everyone to get it. I'd love to keep going on and reading more. And I'm sure, like, as it gets in the end of the book, it shows all the roots, and that's the thing that amazed me, that with the first book, Gardening When It Counts, or Gardening in Hard Times. I'll put it in the show notes below, but it showed the root systems and how large they are. And that's what really, it shocked me the most, and made me realize that we are planting too close together. Like tomatoes, they can go out 4 feet, the root systems down there. So, but anyway, I next week, I'm not sure what we'll be talking about, but it's going to be a busy week. We have a little bit of a rest with lunar gardening. And so I'll be busy cleaning up the garden, and we'll see you in the Thank you for joining me for this week's edition of In the Garden with Susan. I hope you enjoyed listening to some of the insights that Steve Solomon presents in his book, Water Wise Gardening. And I hope you're all motivated to find his book and read it, because it is an amazing book. You can find this podcast and others at Spotify, Podchaser, Radio Public. I have it on my Rumble channel now, and it's on Headliner, and always at my website, www.gardenfairybotanicals.ca. And I hope you all have a great week in the garden. There's so much cleanup and preparation to do. And we will see you next week in the garden.